welcome to Structures, the show that explores Toronto's amazing history and architecture. I'm Colleen Walsh. On Jarvis Street is Angelini's, an Italian restaurant that was originally built for George Horace Gooderham, a prominent 19th century Torontonian. It is one of the surviving residences on Jarvis, a street that was once home to many of our city's most powerful leaders.
When people come in, first of all, they all serve because it's a plaque for the historical board right at the house. And the people, they read that all the details, and then they come in the house and they love everything about the house. And they're very curious to look around and check all the detail.
To find this house in such marvelous shape and have been cared for. I mean, it's so incredible. The fireplaces, the windows, the stained glass windows, the details of the house. It's just so important that a house like this would be kept in the city of Toronto and used as a restaurant where anybody can come.
There was a time when Jarvis Street was one of the city's most prestigious residential streets. It was lined with chestnut trees and mansions belonging to the who's who of Toronto. While that time has passed, some old homes still exist, including 504 Jarvis. Built in 1890, this mansion survives as a restaurant. Patrons dine while soaking in the atmosphere of high society 19th century Toronto. Angelini's restaurant was originally built for George Horace Gooderham, who held top positions in many Toronto businesses. He was also Commodore of the Royal Canadian Yacht Club and president of Ridley College in St. Catharines. George Horace Gooderham was born into the distillery business that was started by his grandfather, William. The patriarch of this large English family moved to Toronto in the 1830s and helped found one of the most successful distilleries in the world.
William Gooderham and his brother-in-law, James Wirtz, were involved in the Gooderham distillery. He came over, I guess, in 1832, having sent his brother-in-law over to kind of scout the property. It was originally built as a grist mill, but they discovered that the byproduct was more valuable when used in the creation of whiskey, so it eventually became a distillery.
As the distillery continued to expand, new buildings were needed to develop the site at Trinity Streets. The Gooderhams liked the work of David Roberts, who, along with his son David Jr., became the Gooderhams' architect for decades.
David Roberts Sr. Emigrated from Ireland to Canada via New York City, and he arrived in Toronto in 1844. And at that time, William Gooderham had his fairly young distillery business. It was about 10 years old. Gooderham always, the best craftspeople, got the best equipment wherever it came from, so it was a perfect fit.
One of David Roberts' most impressive works was the Gooderham's Stone Distillery, erected in 1869. It was rebuilt after a fire and looks almost identical to the original, although today it's no longer by the water's edge. George Horace grew up in the distillery business started by his father. He also absorbed many of his grandfather's interests, his connections with the railways and insurance companies. William was a devout Anglican, so devout that his church, Little Trinity, was for a time called Gooderham's Church. His grandson, George Horace, would later join St. Paul's on Bloor. By the time of William's passing in 1881, Gooderham and Wirtz was an industrial mecca in Toronto. William's third son, George, of George Horace, became president of the company and, in turn, one of the most important men in the province.
In the late 1800s, George Sr. and George Horace decided to build homes of their own. While George Jr. built this home here on Jarvis Street, his father built on St. George, another fashionable residential street for Toronto's privileged.
This time around, David Roberts Jr. was given the contract. In addition to designing homes for his father and son, David Roberts Jr. was the architect behind a number of other residences for the Gooderham family in Toronto. While several have since vanished, the house of George Horace's uncle, Charles, stands at 592 Sherbourne Street. It was built in the 1880s when Sherbourne, like Jarvis, was a street of power and privilege. Since that time, it has been transformed into a hotel with some original features still intact. The new home for George Sr. was built in a rapidly developing neighborhood known as the Annex.
135 St. George Street, which is at a very prominent corner where St. George and Bloor Street meet, contains a building that's probably the pinnacle of domestic Romanesque revival architecture in Toronto. It's absolutely exquisite.
They're very similar, except the father's house is a bit grander. But very interestingly, this is the one on Jarvis was built in the area where people of wealth had lived in the city, and the one in the Annex is where people were moving to. The Annex is was just starting up at that. It's a very interesting transition between the old rich neighborhood and the new rich neighborhood.
Just as father and son were settling into their new homes, a grand new head office was built for the distillery. When we return, we'll explore more of that unique office building and the home of George Horace Gooderham, two structures that are well preserved in modern-day Toronto.
In 1892, George decided to move the headquarters of the distillery and the family's other businesses to what became the Flatiron Building.
Shortly after the home of George H. Gooderham opened on Jarvis Street, the Gooderham & Worts Distillery head office opened in 1892. Both buildings were designed by the same architect, David Roberts Jr.
Known as the Gooderham Building, this pie-shaped edifice eventually took the name the Flatiron. It's located at the juncture of Front, Church, and Wellington Streets on the site of a building of a similar shape called the Coffin Block.
In 1892, George decided to move the headquarters for the distillery and the family's other businesses to what became the Flatiron Building. The financial center had moved northwest, so he was right there.
Built of red Credit Valley sandstone, the Flatiron was designed in the Romanesque and French modern Gothic styles.
You know, the Gooderham Building, or the Flatiron Building as we call it, you know, is one of the last remaining, great 19th century downtown. And that's exactly what it was. It faced then the center of town, which was Front and Jarvis, where St. Lawrence Market is today.
Young George H. worked at the Flatiron Building for several years. During this time, he assumed the position of director of the distillery while expanding into various business and philanthropic ventures. Born in 1868, George Horace Gooderham was the 8th born of 12 children. He attended the normal school at Yonge and Gould before attending Jarvis.
George Horace was a real philanthropist. He was involved with the Ontario legislature. He was an MPP for many years. He loved sailing, as did many members of his family, so he was the Commodore of the Royal Canadian Yacht Club for many years. He apparently was involved with the school board, the local school board. He was involved with the Canadian National Exhibition. He even ran for mayor, although unsuccessfully, and I think he ran for mayor during part of the time that he lived in this house here.
At the age of 21, George H. decided to move to Jarvis Street. As one of the oldest streets in Toronto, change came to Jarvis in the 1850s when politician Oliver Mowat had a home built south of Wellesley. It too stands today as part of Canada's National Ballet School. Soon after, Other prominent families came to this street, including Hart Massey, who lived in a home that is now the Keg Mansion. By the late 19th century, Jarvis was one of the most enviable addresses in Toronto.
This was the street. This is where anybody who would come up in the world wanted to have their home. Much like today, Rosedale or Forest Hill, is what, is to modern Toronto. Jarvis Street was back at the turn of the last century there.
George Horace had his home built north of Wellesley on the west side of Jarvis, where the Jarvis Street lacrosse grounds were once a sports for the area. By the time George Horace arrived here, Jarvis was home to Toronto's Upper 10.
He would have been interested in coming here because it was the fashionable street. Mrs. Cawthra, who was the widow of the fabulously successful financier William Cawthra, had moved from her palatial residence down at Bay. She moved up to Jarvis Street, established herself at Isabella and Jarvis, and we still have Cawthra Street, in another palatial residence, and she set the tone. Society followed. George clearly was one of those, and he could, among other things, look out his front window and keep an eye on the Masseys, who were directly across the street.
David Roberts Jr. was hired to design the home for George Horace.
It was really his starter home. He was about 21 years old. I believe he was newlywed and perhaps had one child. I think it was his first home from his father's home down at the Distillery District. He certainly was setting out to establish himself as somebody of consequence. This is a beautiful house, and yet it's not nearly, of course, nearly as large or as grand as his father's house. This house was designed slightly before 135, so Roberts might have been working out some of his themes and approaches.
The new house was built in the Smithsonian Romanesque style, straddling the corner of today's Jarvis and Cawthra Square.
The Richardsonian Romanesque style was a very important style because it was a revival style, but it also allowed a lot of sculptural development, a lot of very innovative things could be done with Romanesque that couldn't be done with other revival styles. This house on Jarvis Street is a bit smaller in scale. It's not as grand as the house the father on St. George and Bloor. And I think one of the big differences is the porte cochere. The porte cochere is a sense of extreme grandeur, and you often added those to very almost palatial style of houses. This house on Jarvis, there's no porte cochere. It's a simpler but very, very elegant house.
David Roberts Jr. designed the residence for George Gooderham at 135 St. George in Richardsonian, a more robust style than 504 Jarvis Street.
During the time George Horace lived here at 504 Jarvis Street, he was busy, both professionally and personally. Not only was he an executive for numerous insurance companies, he was director of the Canadian National Exhibition. This was also a time when his family expanded. In fact, several of his children were born right in this house.
So when he built this house, he already had one child. In all, he had children. So his last four, including my grandfather, were born in this house. Apparently, my Aunt Mary Hogarth, who was his daughter, remembers looking out the top floor of this house down on Jarvis Street, which was a fancy street. It actually had a wood plank surface, and remembers watching them light the lamps down the street at night as it became dark.
But my mother-in-law was born here in the bedroom upstairs. And then when we heard stories about her children, in fact, one of them, Henry Gooderham, swung on one of the chandeliers in this house, which is always interested to know that. And when you see the chandeliers and how beautifully they're, the weight of them and the design of them, the strength of them, you would realize how a small boy would want to swing on one.
In 19 following the death of his father, George H. Gooderham moved from Jarvis Street to a new home on St. George, also built by David Roberts Jr. And with this new address came a change in career. Taking after his grandfather, George H. entered politics, serving as a Conservative MPP for Toronto. Later, he was promoted to President of the Canadian National Exhibition and honored by a fountain in his name. He also followed in the footsteps of his father and grandfather, involvement in the Royal Canadian Yacht Club.
George Horace loved sailing just as his father did. His father was a Commodore of the RCYC, and then subsequently, George Horace also became a Commodore.
While George H. lived the rest of his life on St. George Street, 504 Jarvis was continuously occupied by individuals and groups, maintaining much of its architectural integrity. For many years, Big Brothers of Toronto operated out of this building, a move that likely saved it from the wrecking ball.
Downtown here became quite industrialized, and a lot of these homes were turned into factories, into flop houses, into offices, and it just completely lost its appeal. And even by the 1930s and 40s, there were no families left living on Jarvis Street. They had all moved out, moved on.
Next, we'll take a look at how the home for George Horace Gooderham was preserved and given a new use for everyone to enjoy. Fortunately, a few mansions survive on Jarvis Street from the days when George Horace and other Toronto leaders lived here. In the mid-1970s, two restaurateurs envisioned this old home as a new Italian fine dining establishment.
I was with my husband. We were go to downtown and shopping. And when I saw this house, and it was for rent, and then I love it. Soon I saw it, and I said, I would love to buy this house. It was for sale. And a week later, we drive again downtown, and we saw the sign for sale. And right away, we put an offer, and we bought it.
The 1970s were a pivotal time in Toronto's heritage preservation movement, and this old home became protected under the city's heritage designation. With much of its original features untouched, the Angelinis did some restoration work to bring back the structure's former glory.
We did a lot of work in the house. We repainted, we repolished the wood. We try very hard to take good care of it and to keep very much the original things. When we bought the house, one of the Gooderham family gave us an old picture, and we noticed on the picture was a veranda, and on the side of the house. So we approached the historical board if we could rebuild, and we did rebuild. We have to rebuild exactly where was the old one, and now we have enclosed is our major George bar. And we love to have it because we use all the year round. When we added the veranda, there are some columns on the veranda, and they want we reproduce exactly the same, and we did, and they were very happy about it.
On the first floor, rooms that had been the Gooderhams' living parlor and dining areas were turned into a new restaurant space. Opening in the early 1980s, Angelini's became a popular Italian restaurant for the area with locals and guests such as Liza Minnelli, Leona Boyd, and Liberace. In 2006, the business was sold and Mrs. Angelini planned to retire, but after just 1 year, came back and reopened the restaurant. Known to some locals as Mama Angelini, this restaurant owner continues to be amazed by the architectural features of this century-old structure.
The beauty of this house is the high ceiling, the different detail. Every door it has a different details. And in the beginning of the house, we had a carpet, which now I took it out and I bring to the original floor, which I find so many beautiful design, and which I love it. I find it so unique.
Although not as grand as his father's, the house of George Horace reveals what it was like to live large in 19th century Toronto. Gooderham was not unlike other privileged citizens whose residence was rich with detail.
One of the things I've noticed in houses of the wealthy is the hall. Now, if you think about it, a hall is essentially wasted space. You don't need anything more than a little vestibule. But if you have more money and prestige, you can make that a major room. And it's exquisite. There's a grand staircase coming down into it, richly worked. You have a lot of the same patterns in the woodwork, coffered ceilings, coffered walls, but not as much individual carving, magnificently plastered ceilings. Another thing that I always think about when I go into places like this is that the craftsmen who carved the wood are anonymous. We don't know who they were, and yet they did this exquisite work. They deserve remembered.
Since Angelini's first opened, customers not only come here for traditional Italian cuisine, but also to absorb the ambiance of this old home's history.
As soon as they walk in, they love the entrance, and they love the staircase, and everybody loves that table called number 9, which has a lot of woodwork, and they love to sit in there. We have some history also in the menu, which talk all about the house when it's been built and who had it and everything. So I thought that was a little touch to put there. People be able to see and read about it.
Loved by customers, Angelini's restaurant means just as much to the many generations of the Gooderham family.
It's terribly important to this city to have a house like this. It's wonderful to have them here because they've been kept well, especially this house.
Much has changed in Toronto since the time when the Gooderham family and the distillery were front and center in Toronto's business life. While the distillery is no longer in operation, we still have some of the businesses and homes that the Gooderham family built. The Flatiron has become one of the most photographed structures in Toronto. 135 St. George Street became the York Club, a private club that will celebrate its 100th anniversary in 2009. Fortunately, the home of George Horace was also retained, keeping alive the memory of this Gooderham descendant and the heyday of Jarvis Street.
In 19th century Toronto, Jarvis Street was the street to live on. It was the street of mansions, and it was an extremely elegant, treed street, wonderful, wonderful thing. We've kind of wrecked that a little bit recently, but there are stretches of Jarvis that are still demonstrating that. This particular block with this building kind of anchors the block, and it really shows you what Jarvis Street was like.
George Horace Gooderham passed away in 1942, but his legacy has not been forgotten. At the RCYC on St. George Street is a painting honoring his long-standing contribution to the club. In addition, George Horace Gooderham is a familiar name at Ridley College in St. Catharines. He was president for 30 years. There, a building is named in his honor.
Perhaps the greatest monument to George Horace Gooderham is his home on Jarvis Street. More than 100 years after he lived here, this building allows a glimpse into life of the privileged, when Jarvis Street was the pride of Toronto. I'm Colleen Walsh. We'll see you next time on Structures.